300 million years ago, Earth was a world that'd blow your mind if you could see it. The continents were slowly grinding together, pushed around by the relentless force of tectonic plates sliding over the planet's gooey mantle. The climate was muggy and warm. The atmosphere was loaded with oxygen at crazy high levels, and life was thriving in forms that were as beautiful as they were alien. This was an age when massive forests blanketed huge chunks of land, when insects grew to the size of modern birds, and when the first reptiles were taking their shaky steps toward the dominance over land that had come tens of millions of years down the line. The world of 300 million years ago was a world in transition, hanging in the balance between the ancient life forms of the Carboniferous and the coming changes of the Permian period, when all the continents would slam together into one massive supercontinent called Panja. During this time, known to geologists as the Late Carboniferous or Pennsylvanian, the planet's geography was fundamentally different from what we see today. Instead of the 7 continents scattered across the globe, there were several major landmasses slowly converging in a geological dance that had been going on for hundreds of millions of years. The southern supercontinent Gondwana, which included what would eventually become South America, Africa, Antarctica, Australia, and India, was already a massive unified block of land. To the north, several smaller continents including Laurentia, which would become North America, Baltica, which would form much of Europe, and Siberia were drifting closer together, destined to collide and merge. Between these northern landmasses and Gondwana lay a vast ocean called the Rheic Ocean, which was steadily shrinking as the continents moved toward their eventual union. The collision of these continental plates wasn't some quick event you could catch on video. It was happening at a pace that makes watching paint dry seem exciting, maybe a few centimeters per year at most. But over millions of years, these tiny movements added up to something absolutely massive. When continental plates collide, they don't just slide past each other smoothly. They crumple and fold, pushing up enormous mountain ranges and creating zones of intense geological activity. Around 300 million years ago, several of these collision zones were active, building the foundation of what would become Pangaea's spectacular mountain systems. One of the most significant of these collisions was happening in what is now eastern North America and western Europe. Laurentia and Baltica were smashing together, and the impact was creating the ancestral Appalachian Mountains, part of a much larger mountain chain that geologists call the Central Pangaean Mountains. These weren't the worn-down, gentle peaks we see in the modern Appalachians. Fresh from their formation, they towered into the sky, probably rivaling the Himalayas in height and majesty. Rain and snow pounded these new mountains, and rivers carved deep valleys through the uplifted rock, carrying sediment down to vast lowland basins where it would pile up in thick layers that had eventually become sedimentary rock. Further south, Gondwana was colliding with the southern edge of Laurentia, an event known as the Alleghanian orogeny. This collision was squeezing and deforming rocks, pushing up more mountains, and causing earthquakes that would have registered off the charts on any modern seismograph. The geological violence of these continental collisions created zones of metamorphism, where existing rocks were transformed by heat and pressure into new forms, their minerals realigning and recrystallizing under the immense forces at work deep underground. The atmosphere 300 million years ago was radically different from the air we breathe today. Oxygen levels had reached an all-time high during the Carboniferous period, peaking at somewhere around 30 to 35% compared to today's 21%. This super-oxygenated atmosphere was a direct result of the planet's incredible forests. During this time, vast swamps and wetlands covered huge areas of the tropical and subtropical regions, particularly across what is now North America, Europe, and parts of Asia. These swamps were dominated by massive trees, but not the kind of trees you'd recognize. These were giant club mosses, horsetails, and tree ferns, some reaching heights of over 30 meters. What made these forests so important for atmospheric oxygen was what happened when they died. When a tree falls in a modern forest, it typically decays pretty quickly, consumed by fungi, bacteria, and various decomposers. This decay process uses up oxygen and releases carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere, completing the carbon cycle. But here's the kicker. 300 million years ago, the organisms that could efficiently break down woody plant material, particularly the tough compound lignin that gives wood its strength, hadn't really evolved yet. Fungi were around, sure, but they weren't nearly as good at decomposing wood as their modern descendants. So when these ancient trees died and fell into the swampy water, they didn't decay. Instead, they just piled up, layer upon layer, getting buried under sediment and gradually being transformed by heat and pressure into coal. This massive burial of organic carbon meant that the oxygen those trees had produced through photosynthesis stayed in the atmosphere instead of being consumed during decomposition. Over millions of years, this led to oxygen levels climbing higher and higher. The high oxygen concentration had profound effects on life, particularly on animals that relied on diffusion to get oxygen to their tissues. Arthropods, which include insects, spiders, and their relatives, have a respiratory system that's based on a network of tubes called tracheae. Air diffuses through these tubes directly to the tissues, and the efficiency of this system depends heavily on the concentration of oxygen in the air. In the superoxygenated atmosphere of the Carboniferous, arthropods could grow to absolutely enormous sizes. The skies of 300 million years ago were ruled by giant insects that'd make most people run screaming. Meganeura, a dragonfly relative, had a wingspan that could reach 70 centimeters, about the size of a modern hawk. These weren't clumsy flyers either. Their fossil wings show intricate vein patterns that would have made them agile and maneuverable predators, hunting other flying insects across the canopy of the coal forests. Arthropleura, a millipede relative, could grow to over 2 meters long and probably weighed as much as a large dog. These massive arthropods would have been an impressive and somewhat terrifying sight, scuttling through the undergrowth of the ancient forests. The climate 300 million years ago was generally warm and humid across much of the planet, though there were significant regional variations. The position of the continents relative to the equator played a huge role in determining local climates. Much of the landmass that would eventually form the tropical and subtropical parts of Panja was positioned near the equator at this time, creating ideal conditions for the vast coal swamps. These equatorial regions experienced year-round warmth and heavy rainfall, with no real dry season to speak of. The constant moisture and warm temperatures created a greenhouse environment where plant growth was explosive. However, the southern part of Gondwana was positioned over the South Pole, and this region was experiencing a major glaciation. Massive ice sheets covered parts of what are now South America, Southern Africa, India, Antarctica, and Australia. Evidence for this glaciation comes from distinctive geological features left behind by glaciers, including scratched and polished bedrock where glaciers scraped across the surface, and deposits of till, the unsorted mixture of clay, sand, gravel, and boulders that glaciers leave behind when they melt. The presence of these glacial deposits in regions that are now tropical was one of the key pieces of evidence that convinced scientists that the continents had moved over geological time. The existence of ice sheets at the South Pole, while tropical swamps flourished at the equator, meant that Earth 300 million years ago had steep temperature gradients from pole to equator, probably even steeper than today. This would have driven powerful atmospheric circulation patterns, with warm, moisture-laden air rising at the equator and cool, dry air sinking at higher latitudes. The Coriolis effect, caused by Earth's rotation, would have deflected these winds, creating patterns similar to modern trade winds and westerlies. The oceans of this time were vast and largely unexplored territory for terrestrial creatures, though they teemed with life of their own. The major ocean, which would eventually become part of Panthalassa as Pangea formed, was home to a diverse array of marine organisms. Fish were abundant and diverse, including both the ray-finned fish that would eventually dominate the oceans and lobe-finned fish, some of which were the ancestors of all land vertebrates. Sharks were common predators, and many of them looked pretty similar to modern sharks. though there were also some bizarre forms with strange tooth arrangements and body shapes. Among the most successful marine animals were the cephalopods, the group that includes modern squids, octopuses, and nautiluses. 300 million years ago, cephalopods with external shells were incredibly diverse and abundant. Ammonoids, which would later become even more successful in the Mesozoic era, were starting to diversify. These animals had coiled shells divided into chambers, and they controlled their buoyancy by adjusting the amount of gas and liquid in these chambers, allowing them to move up and down in the water column. Nautiloids, straight-shelled or coiled relatives of ammonoids, were also common, some reaching lengths of several meters. The seafloor was carpeted with various invertebrates. Brachiopods, which look superficially like clams but are actually quite different, were extremely common and diverse. These animals attached themselves to the seafloor or to rocks and filtered food particles from the water. Crinoids, also called sea lilies, were abundant on many seafloors. These animals are relatives of starfish and sea urchins, but they look more like underwater flowers, with a long stalk anchoring them to the bottom and feathery arms spreading out to catch food particles drifting by in the current. Trilobites, those iconic fossils that are often the first thing people think of when they hear the word fossil, were still around 300 million years ago, though they were past their prime and declining in diversity. They'd been incredibly successful for nearly 300 million years by this point, but they'd never really recover from the late Devonian extinctions, and they'd be completely wiped out by the end of the Permian. Coral reefs existed 300 million years ago, but they were built by different kinds of corals than modern reefs. The corals that build most modern reefs, the scleractinian or stony corals, hadn't evolved yet. Instead, Carboniferous reefs were built by rugose corals, which had a different internal structure, and tabulate corals, which formed colonial structures with a honeycomb-like appearance. These reefs were important ecosystems, providing habitat for a huge variety of other marine organisms, including fish, cephalopods, brachiopods, and various other invertebrates. The transition from water to land had already happened by 300 million years ago, but it was still a relatively recent development in the grand scheme of Earth's history. The first tetrapods, four-limbed vertebrates, had crawled out of the water sometime in the late Devonian, maybe around 370 million years ago. By the Carboniferous, their descendants had diversified into a variety of forms adapted to different lifestyles. Amphibians were abundant and diverse 300 million years ago, far more so than they are today. These weren't the small frogs and salamanders we're familiar with. Many Carboniferous amphibians were large, heavy-bodied creatures that probably spent much of their time in or near water. Archaeops, which would appear a bit later but represents this general type, was a stocky predator about 2 meters long, with a massive skull and powerful jaws lined with sharp teeth. It probably hunted fish in the water and any smaller animals it could catch on land. Some amphibians had adapted to a more terrestrial lifestyle, though they still needed to return to water to breed, laying their eggs in ponds and streams. Their larvae, like modern tadpoles, were fully aquatic, with gills, and they'd undergo metamorphosis to develop lungs and other features needed for life on land. This dependence on water for reproduction was a significant limitation that would eventually be overcome by the evolution of the amniotic egg. The amniotic egg was probably the single most important evolutionary innovation for the conquest of land by vertebrates. Unlike amphibian eggs, which have to be laid in water or at least in very moist environments, amniotic eggs have a waterproof shell and a series of internal membranes that protect the developing embryo and prevent it from drying out. This meant that animals with amniotic eggs could reproduce away from water, opening up vast areas of land that had been essentially off-limits to amphibians. The first amniotes, the group that includes all reptiles, birds, and mammals, evolved sometime in the early Carboniferous, probably around 320 to 310 million years ago. By 300 million years ago, they were starting to diversify, though they were still relatively small and not particularly common in most ecosystems. These early amniotes looked somewhat lizard-like, with sprawling limbs and long tails. They were probably insectivorous, feeding on the abundant arthropods of the coal forests. One of the most important evolutionary splits in amniote history was happening right around this time. The amniotes were diverging into two major lineages based on the structure of their skulls, specifically the number and position of openings called temporal fenestrae in the bone behind the eye socket. One lineage, the synapsids, had a single temporal fenestra. This group would eventually give rise to mammals, though that wouldn't happen for another 250 million years or so. The other major lineage, the sauropsids, would eventually split into two groups, one leading to modern reptiles, and another leading to dinosaurs and birds. 300 million years ago, the synapsids were in their early stages, but they'd soon become incredibly successful. The most primitive synapsids are called pelycosaurs, and while they wouldn't become really diverse until the early Permian, some were already around in the Late Carboniferous. These animals retained many primitive features, including a sprawling gait similar to modern lizards, but they were experimenting with various body plans and ecological niches. The forests of 300 million years ago were unlike anything you'd see today. Walking through one would have felt like stepping onto an alien planet. The dominant trees weren't the flowering plants, or even the conifers that make up most modern forests. Instead, they were giant versions of plants that today are small and relatively insignificant. Lepidodendron, sometimes called scale trees because of the distinctive diamond-shaped leaf scars that covered their trunks, could grow to over 30 meters tall. Despite their impressive height, these trees had relatively shallow root systems, and they probably fell over pretty easily during storms. Their leaves were long and needle-like, clustered at the ends of branches, giving them a palm-like appearance. They reproduced using spores rather than seeds, releasing them from cone-like structures at the branch tips. Sigillaria was similar to Lepidodendron, but with a more columnar trunk that had vertical rather than diamond-shaped patterns. These trees also grew to impressive heights and formed dense stands in the coal swamps. Like Lepidodendron, they were lycopods, giant relatives of modern club mosses. Calamites was a giant horsetail, related to the small equisetum plants you might see growing near streams today. Calamites could reach heights of over 20 meters, with hollow, jointed stems and whorls of needle-like leaves at each joint. These plants often grew in dense thickets along waterways, and their hollow stems would have made distinctive sounds when wind blew through them. Tree ferns, not too different from modern tree ferns, though generally larger, added another layer to these forests. Their graceful fronds would have created a canopy in areas where the giant lycopods and horsetails dominated. Unlike the lycopods and horsetails, which reproduced with spores, some plants were evolving more sophisticated reproductive strategies. Seed ferns, which weren't actually ferns at all despite having fern-like leaves, were starting to become important members of these ecosystems. These plants produced seeds rather than spores, a major evolutionary advancement. Seeds contain a food supply for the developing embryo and a protective coat, allowing them to survive in drier conditions and giving the offspring a better start in life. Some seed ferns were small, shrubby plants, while others grew into trees. The first true conifers were also appearing around this time. These early conifers were probably smaller than their modern relatives and lived in drier, upland areas away from the coal swamps. They had needle-like leaves with a thick, waxy cuticle to prevent water loss, an adaptation to environments where water was less readily available than in the swamps. The forest floor would have been covered with a thick layer of leaf litter and fallen branches, though as mentioned earlier, this material wasn't decaying quickly. Smaller plants, including various types of ferns, more primitive vascular plants, and perhaps some mosses, would have grown wherever enough light penetrated through the canopy. The whole environment would have been incredibly humid, with moisture dripping from the vegetation and mist hanging in the air. Life in these forests was diverse and often bizarre by modern standards. The giant arthropods certainly grabbed attention, but there were plenty of other animals scuttling around. Smaller insects were abundant and diverse, including early relatives of modern cockroaches, which were already highly successful. These ancient roaches were sometimes quite large, with some species reaching lengths of several centimeters. Arachnids, the group that includes spiders and scorpions, were well represented. Some fossil scorpions from around this time were huge, reaching lengths of over 70 centimeters. Whether these giant scorpions were aquatic or terrestrial is still debated among paleontologists, but either way, they would have been formidable predators. Spiders were around too, and some of them probably produced silk for building webs to catch flying insects, though the earliest spider webs were likely simpler than the elaborate orb webs many modern spiders construct. Among the vertebrates inhabiting these forests, amphibians were dominant in terms of size and diversity. They filled various ecological roles, from top predators to small insectivores. Their dependence on water meant they were most common in and around the swamps and along the rivers and streams that flowed through the forests. The early amniotes, meanwhile, were probably more common in drier upland areas, though they ventured into the coal swamps as well. These small, reptile-like creatures would have been most active during the day, when they could bask in patches of sunlight to warm their bodies. Like modern reptiles, they were probably ectothermic, relying on external heat sources to regulate their body temperature. The ecology of these ancient forests was complex, with multiple trophic levels and intricate relationships between species. At the base were the photosynthetic plants, converting sunlight into chemical energy. Herbivorous insects and other arthropods fed on these plants, and they in turn were eaten by predatory insects, spiders, and small vertebrates. Larger amphibians and early amniotes fed on these smaller predators, and at the top of the food chain were the largest amphibian predators. 300 million years ago, the world's rivers and streams were teeming with life in ways that had seemed both familiar and utterly strange to modern eyes. These waterways carved through the landscape, draining the highlands and winding through the vast coal swamps before emptying into shallow seas. The water was warm, often stained dark brown by tannins leached from decaying plant material, and it moved slowly through the flat, swampy lowlands, creating a maze of channels, oxbow lakes, and stagnant pools. Fish were the dominant vertebrates in these aquatic ecosystems, and they'd already diversified into most of the major groups we recognize today. Ray-finned fish, which make up the vast majority of modern fish species, were well established and continuing to evolve new forms. These fish had lightweight skeletons and thin, flexible fins supported by bony rays, making them agile swimmers. Some were small schooling fish that fed on plankton and small invertebrates, while others were larger predators hunting other fish. But the really interesting fish from a human perspective were the lobe-finned fish, a group that includes the ancestors of all land vertebrates. By 300 million years ago, most lobe-finned fish were fully aquatic, but they retained the sturdy, fleshy fins that their ancestors had used to prop themselves up in shallow water and eventually to crawl onto land. These fins, supported by a robust skeleton of bones that would eventually evolve into arms and legs, gave these fish their name. Freshwater sharks cruised through the rivers and swamps, though they were quite different from modern marine sharks. These ancient sharks had different tooth structures and body shapes adapted to hunting in murky freshwater environments. Some had bizarre tooth whorls, spiral arrangements of teeth that grew continuously throughout their lives, creating structures that look almost like buzzsaws. Exactly how these sharks used these strange teeth is still debated, but they were probably effective at gripping and cutting through prey. The water was also home to numerous invertebrates. Freshwater clams and snails lived on the muddy bottoms, filtering food particles from the water or grazing on algae. Various types of aquatic insects, including early dragonfly and mayfly nymphs, were abundant. These nymphs lived underwater for months or even years before emerging as adults, and they were important predators of smaller invertebrates. One of the most crucial aspects of these freshwater ecosystems was their role as breeding grounds for amphibians. During breeding season, the water would have been filled with amphibian eggs, laid in gelatinous masses or strings attached to underwater vegetation. These eggs would hatch into larvae that looked nothing like the adults, essentially small fish with external gills. The larvae were voracious predators, feeding on whatever they could catch, and they grew rapidly. After weeks or months, depending on the species, they'd undergo metamorphosis, developing lungs, losing their gills, and transforming into miniature versions of the adults. The shallow seas and coastlines of 300 million years ago were transition zones where terrestrial and marine ecosystems met and mingled. These areas were incredibly productive, receiving nutrients washed down from the land by rivers, while also benefiting from the upwelling of nutrients from deeper waters. The result was an abundance of life that supported complex food webs. Tidal flats would have been exposed during low tide, revealing a landscape of mud and sand rippled by waves and currents. These flats were home to countless burrowing organisms, including worms, clams, and crustaceans, that spent high tide filter feeding or hunting in the water and low tide safely buried in the sediment. Shorebirds didn't exist yet, since birds wouldn't evolve for another 150 million years. But various arthropods, and possibly some small amphibians, would have scavenged along the tide line, feeding on whatever the ocean washed up. Salt marshes, areas of coastal wetland flooded by tides and dominated by salt-tolerant plants, were probably present in some areas. The exact composition of these plant communities would have been different from modern salt marshes, but the ecological role would have been similar, providing nursery habitat for juvenile fish, stabilizing sediments, and filtering nutrients from runoff before it reached the open ocean. Mangroves as we know them today didn't exist yet, but there may have been analogous ecosystems with different plants adapted to life in the intertidal zone. These areas would have been characterized by plants with specialized roots that could tolerate being submerged in salt water and could anchor in soft, unstable sediments. The accumulation of organic material in the coal swamps was creating deposits that would eventually become some of the world's most important coal seams. This process was happening on a massive scale, with plant material piling up faster than it could decay. The thick vegetation and year-round plant growth meant that enormous amounts of carbon were being pulled out of the atmosphere and locked away in what would become coal. The formation of coal is a complex process that takes millions of years. First, the plant material accumulates in an oxygen-poor environment like a swamp where decay is slow. This partially decayed material is called peat, and it's similar to what forms in modern bogs. As more sediment piles on top, the peat gets buried deeper and deeper. The weight of the overlying sediment compresses it, squeezing out water and volatile compounds. Heat from Earth's interior also increases with depth, and this heat, plus the pressure, causes chemical changes in the organic material. Over millions of years, peat is transformed first into lignite, a soft brownish coal, then into bituminous coal, the common black coal used for most industrial purposes, and finally, under the most extreme conditions, into anthracite, a hard, shiny coal that's almost pure carbon. The different ranks of coal reflect different degrees of metamorphism, with anthracite being the most changed from the original plant material. The coal that was forming 300 million years ago in the Late Carboniferous would eventually fuel the Industrial Revolution. It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it. Those ancient swamp forests, growing in a world without a single human or even a single dinosaur, would power the transformation of human society hundreds of millions of years later. The energy stored in that coal is sunlight from 300 million years ago, captured by photosynthesis, and locked away until humans figured out how to release it by burning. The geological processes shaping Earth 300 million years ago were operating on timescales that are hard to wrap your head around. Mountains were rising, millimeter by millimeter each year, as continental plates collided. At the same time, erosion was wearing them down grain by grain, as rain and ice broke up the rock and rivers carried the pieces away. These processes were in constant competition, with uplift creating new mountains and erosion trying to level them. The sediment eroded from the mountains didn't just disappear. It was carried downstream by rivers and eventually deposited in sedimentary basins, flat or gently sloping areas where the land was slowly subsiding. These basins filled with layer upon layer of sediment, each layer recording a moment in geological time. Sand deposited by rivers became sandstone. Mud that settled in quiet water became shale. The calcium carbonate shells of marine organisms that accumulated on the seafloor became limestone. These sedimentary rocks are like history books, preserving evidence of ancient environments and the organisms that lived in them. By studying these rocks, geologists can reconstruct what conditions were like 300 million years ago. The grain size and composition of sandstone tells you about the energy of the water that deposited it and what kind of rocks were being eroded upstream. The fossils in limestone tell you what kind of marine life existed and what the water conditions were like. The presence of coal tells you there was a swamp with abundant plant life. Volcanic activity was ongoing in various parts of the world, adding another dimension to the dynamic geological processes. While there weren't any supermassive eruptions happening right at 300 million years ago, localized volcanism was common, especially along the margins of the converging continents where subduction zones were active. When an oceanic plate slides beneath a continental plate in a subduction zone, the descending plate carries water and other volatiles down into the hot mantle. This water lowers the melting point of the mantle rock, causing it to melt and form magma. This magma, being less dense than the surrounding rock, rises toward the surface. Sometimes it erupts violently, creating explosive volcanoes that throw ash and rock high into the atmosphere. Other times it oozes out more gently as lava flows. The volcanic arcs created by subduction zones would have been prominent features of the landscape in certain areas. These chains of volcanoes, similar to modern examples like the Andes or the islands of Indonesia, would have been sites of frequent earthquakes and eruptions. The ash and lava from these volcanoes added new material to the continents, slowly building up the land. Volcanic eruptions had short-term effects on climate too. When a volcano erupts explosively, it can inject huge amounts of ash and sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere. The ash settles out fairly quickly, but the sulfur dioxide reacts with water to form tiny droplets of sulfuric acid that can stay aloft for years. These droplets reflect sunlight back into space, causing temporary cooling of Earth's climate. A single large eruption can cool global temperatures by a degree or more for a year or two. The tectonic collisions building the Proto-Pangean mountain ranges were also creating earthquakes on a regular basis. These weren't the occasional rare earthquakes we might experience in stable continental interiors today. Active collision zones would have experienced frequent, powerful earthquakes as the immense stresses built up in the crust were suddenly released. Imagine living near one of these collision zones 300 million years ago. The ground would shake regularly, sometimes just gentle tremors that'd make the water in a pond ripple, other times violent shaking that'd topple trees and trigger landslides. Over thousands of years, these earthquakes would have completely reshaped the landscape, creating fault scarps where one block of rock was suddenly thrust up relative to another, and causing rivers to change course when their channels were disrupted. The formation of mountain ranges also affected precipitation patterns. When moisture-laden air masses moving inland from the ocean encounter a mountain range, they're forced to rise. As air rises, it cools, and cool air can't hold as much moisture as warm air. The result is that water vapor condenses and falls as rain or snow on the windward side of the mountains. By the time the air passes over the peaks and descends on the other side, it's lost most of its moisture, creating a rain shadow where the climate is much drier. This effect would have been pronounced in the mountain ranges forming as Panja assembled. The windward slopes would have been lush and green, receiving heavy precipitation and supporting dense forests. The leeward slopes and the land beyond would have been much drier, possibly even desert-like in some areas. This created a patchwork of different environments and climates across relatively short distances. The ocean currents 300 million years ago were driven by the same basic forces that drive modern ocean currents. Differences in temperature and salinity, wind patterns, and the Coriolis effect caused by Earth's rotation. However, the configuration of the continents and ocean basins was different. so the specific pattern of currents would have been different too. Near the equator, warm water would have flowed westward, driven by the trade winds. When this water hit the eastern coast of a continent, it'd have to go somewhere, so part of it would have flowed north and part south, creating warm currents moving toward higher latitudes along the continental margins. These warm currents would have carried heat from the tropics toward the poles, moderating temperatures at higher latitudes, just like the Gulf Stream does for Europe today. In the higher latitudes, cold water would have sunk and flowed toward the equator as deep ocean currents. This sinking of cold, dense water at high latitudes and rising of warm water at the equator is part of a global circulation pattern called thermohaline circulation. This circulation is crucial for distributing heat around the planet and for bringing nutrients up from the deep ocean to the surface where they can support marine life. The Coriolis effect, which deflects moving objects to the right in the northern hemisphere and to the left in the southern hemisphere, would have created rotating current systems called gyres in the major ocean basins. These gyres would have had warm currents on their western sides flowing toward the poles and cool currents on their eastern sides flowing toward the equator. The life in the open ocean 300 million years ago is less well known than life in coastal areas or on land, simply because open ocean environments are less likely to produce fossils. Most organisms that die in the open ocean either get eaten by scavengers or sink to the deep sea floor, where they're unlikely to be preserved, and where the sea floor itself is eventually subducted and destroyed. However, we can make some educated guesses based on the organisms we know about. Small fish and various types of plankton would have formed the base of the food web. Larger predatory fish, sharks, and cephalopods would have hunted these smaller organisms. Some of the cephalopods, particularly some of the nautiloids with their straight shells, grew to impressive sizes and were probably apex predators in the open ocean. Marine reptiles, which would become so important later in the Mesozoic, hadn't really evolved yet 300 million years ago. There were no ichthyosaurs, plesiosaurs, or mosasaurs cruising through the oceans. The vertebrate predators in the ocean were all fish, and they were doing just fine in that role. The deep ocean floor 300 million years ago was probably similar in many ways to the modern deep ocean floor: cold, dark, and covered with fine sediment. Life there would have been sparse and highly adapted to the extreme conditions. Some organisms could probably survive on organic material that drifted down from the sunlit surface waters, a constant, gentle rain of dead plankton and fecal pellets. In some areas, hydrothermal vents might have supported unusual communities of organisms. These vents occur where seawater seeps down through cracks in the oceanic crust, gets heated by magma, and then bursts back out, carrying dissolved minerals. The hot, mineral-rich water supports bacteria that can get energy from chemical reactions rather than from sunlight, a process called chemosynthesis. These bacteria form the base of a food web that's completely independent of photosynthesis, supporting communities of specialized organisms, including giant tube worms, unusual clams and mussels, and various types of crustaceans. We don't have direct fossil evidence of such communities from 300 million years ago, but there's no reason to think they didn't exist, since the basic geological processes creating hydrothermal vents would have been the same. The climate 300 million years ago was showing the effects of the changing geography as the continents converged. The collision of continents and the formation of mountain ranges affected atmospheric circulation patterns, creating new rain shadows and changing precipitation patterns across large areas. The concentration of landmass was starting to increase continentality effects, where areas far from the ocean experience more extreme temperature swings between summer and winter. Oceans have a moderating effect on temperature because water heats up and cools down much more slowly than land. Coastal areas tend to have mild winters and cool summers, while continental interiors have hot summers and cold winters. As the continents came together and interiors became farther from the ocean, these seasonal extremes would have become more pronounced. However, the world was still quite warm overall, warmer than today despite the glaciation at the South Pole. There was no ice at the North Pole, and sea levels were relatively high. The warm temperatures were maintained partly by the high levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which created a greenhouse effect, trapping heat that would otherwise radiate back into space. The seasonal patterns would have been important for life. Many plants probably had distinct growing seasons, even in tropical areas, responding to changes in rainfall rather than temperature. Deciduous plants, which dropped their leaves during unfavorable seasons, were evolving as an adaptation to seasonal climate. This strategy allows plants to conserve water and energy during dry seasons or cold winters when growth isn't possible. Animals, too, would have had to deal with seasonal changes. Some probably migrated, moving to follow favorable conditions or food sources. Others might have become dormant during unfavorable seasons, hiding in burrows or underwater, and slowing their metabolism to wait out periods when food was scarce. These behavioral adaptations to seasonal environments would have been crucial for survival in many areas. The carbon cycle, 300 million years ago, was operating in a way that was slowly drawing down atmospheric carbon dioxide. The burial of organic material in coal swamps was removing carbon from the atmosphere-ocean system and locking it away in sedimentary rocks. At the same time, the weathering of rocks, particularly silicate minerals, was consuming carbon dioxide. When carbon dioxide dissolves in rainwater, it forms a weak acid that reacts with minerals in rocks, breaking them down. The products of this reaction eventually get washed into the ocean, where organisms use them to build shells and skeletons, which eventually become limestone. This process is a major long-term carbon sink. The combination of increased burial of organic carbon and ongoing weathering of the mountains being created by continental collisions was pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere at a fairly rapid rate. This was one of the factors leading to the decline in atmospheric carbon dioxide levels that would continue into the Permian. Lower carbon dioxide levels meant less greenhouse warming, which contributed to the expansion of the ice sheets at the South Pole and generally cooler global temperatures in the Late Carboniferous and early Permian. The plants and animals of 300 million years ago were the product of hundreds of millions of years of evolution, and they were continuing to evolve in response to changing environmental conditions and in response to each other. Evolution is often thought of as a slow process, and in human terms it is. But over millions of years it produces dramatic changes. The evolutionary innovations happening around this time would have profound implications for the future. The amniotic egg was opening up new possibilities for vertebrate life on land. The evolution of more sophisticated respiratory systems in early amniotes was allowing them to be more active and to live in drier environments. The development of different types of teeth specialized for different functions was allowing some animals to exploit food sources that others couldn't use efficiently. Plant evolution was also progressing. The evolution of seeds was a major advancement that would eventually lead to the dominance of seed plants. Seeds provided protection and nutrients for the embryonic plant, allowing it to survive in conditions where spore-bearing plants would fail. The evolution of different dispersal mechanisms for seeds, including wings for wind dispersal and fleshy coverings to attract animals that would eat the fruit and disperse the seeds, would happen later, but was being foreshadowed by the innovations of carboniferous seed ferns. Coevolution between plants and animals was becoming increasingly important. Some insects were probably specializing on particular types of plants, and plants were evolving defenses against herbivory. Chemical defenses, producing compounds that are toxic or unpalatable to herbivores, were probably common. Physical defenses like spines and tough tissues were also important. This evolutionary arms race between plants and the animals that eat them is a major driver of biodiversity, with both sides constantly evolving new strategies. The 300-million-year-old world was a place of incredible diversity and constant change. Every day brought new challenges and opportunities for the organisms living there. Predators hunted prey through the swampy forests. Plants competed for light and nutrients. Individuals that were just a little better adapted than their neighbors had more offspring, passing on their advantageous traits. Over generations, this process shaped species, adapting them ever more precisely to their environments. The insects of 300 million years ago were at the peak of their size and diversity, thriving in the oxygen-rich atmosphere that allowed their inefficient respiratory systems to support much larger bodies than would be possible today. The skies above the coal forests were filled with the buzz and whir of countless wings as these ancient arthropods went about their business of hunting, mating, and avoiding being eaten. Meganeura and its relatives weren't the only giant flying insects around. There were also enormous mayflies with wingspans that could reach 40 centimeters, and various other flying insects that have no close modern relatives. These ancient flyers had a major advantage that modern insects lack. They were the only things in the air. There were no birds, no bats, no pterosaurs. The skies belonged entirely to insects, and they exploited that monopoly to the fullest. The flight of these giant insects would have been impressive to watch. Dragonflies are incredibly agile flyers even today, capable of hovering, flying backwards, and making sharp turns that'd make a fighter pilot jealous. The giant dragonflies of the Carboniferous would have had these same abilities, just scaled up. They could probably spot prey from dozens of meters away with their huge compound eyes, which gave them nearly 360-degree vision, then intercept it with precision. Hunting strategies probably varied among different species. Some might have been ambush predators, perching on branches and waiting for prey to fly past before launching into pursuit. Others might have been active hunters, constantly on the wing searching for prey. Some probably hunted alone, while others might have formed loose aggregations in areas where prey was particularly abundant. The prey of these giant predatory insects would have included smaller flying insects, but also terrestrial prey that they could snatch from vegetation or the ground. A Meganeura swooping down to grab a small amphibian or early reptile from a branch would have been a spectacular sight, and probably a terrifying one if you were that small animal. On the ground and in the leaf litter, a different world of arthropod activity was happening. The giant millipede Arthropleura lumbered through the undergrowth, its many legs moving in coordinated waves. Despite its intimidating size, Arthropleura was probably herbivorous or detritivorous, feeding on plant material or decaying organic matter. Its size would have been a defense against predators, since few things could have easily tackled an animal that size with a tough exoskeleton. Centipedes, the carnivorous cousins of millipedes, were also present, and probably grew to impressive sizes in the oxygen-rich environment. Unlike millipedes, which have 2 pairs of legs per body segment and move slowly, centipedes have 1 pair of legs per segment and can move quickly when pursuing prey or fleeing danger. They're also venomous, using modified front legs called forcipules to inject venom into their prey. A giant carboniferous centipede would have been a formidable predator of the forest floor, capable of overpowering other large arthropods and possibly even small vertebrates. Spiders were diversifying and developing increasingly sophisticated hunting techniques. Some were probably already building webs, though the earliest spider webs were likely simple sheet webs or tangle webs, rather than the elegant orb webs that some modern spiders construct. Others were active hunters that stalked their prey or ambushed it from hiding. The evolution of spider silk was a major innovation that opened up new ecological possibilities. Spider silk is an amazing material, stronger than steel by weight and incredibly elastic. Different types of silk produced by different glands have different properties, and spiders use these various silks for different purposes. Strong silk for the frame of a web, sticky silk for catching prey, fluffy silk for wrapping prey, and fine silk for making egg sacs. Scorpions, which had made the transition from water to land much earlier in the Silurian period, were well-established terrestrial predators. Some reached impressive sizes during the Carboniferous, though whether the largest were still semi-aquatic or fully terrestrial is debated. These ancient scorpions would have been nocturnal hunters, using their pincers to grab prey and their venomous stingers to subdue it. The venom of modern scorpions varies from species to species, with some being only mildly toxic to humans and others being potentially lethal. The giant Carboniferous scorpions probably had equally variable venom potency. The sheer abundance and diversity of arthropods meant that they played crucial roles in these ancient ecosystems. They were pollinators, though the close plant-pollinator relationships we see today with flowering plants and bees hadn't evolved yet. They were decomposers, breaking down dead plant and animal material and recycling nutrients. They were predators and prey, connecting different levels of the food web. Without the arthropods, these ecosystems would have collapsed. The early amniotes, those pioneering reptile-like creatures that were just starting to diversify 300 million years ago, were facing challenges and opportunities that would shape their evolution for hundreds of millions of years to come. Their independence from water for reproduction was a game changer, but it didn't automatically make them dominant. They had to compete with well-established amphibians and deal with the challenges of a terrestrial lifestyle. One of the major challenges was temperature regulation. Modern reptiles are ectothermic, meaning they rely on external heat sources to regulate their body temperature. They bask in the sun to warm up and retreat to shade or burrows to cool down. This strategy works well in many environments, but it has limitations. Ectothermic animals can't maintain a high activity level in cool conditions, and they have to spend a lot of time and energy on thermoregulation. The early amniotes, 300 million years ago, were almost certainly ectothermic like modern reptiles. This would have constrained their activity patterns and their geographical distribution. They would have been most active during the warmest parts of the day, and would have needed to live in areas where they could reliably find warm spots for basking. However, being ectothermic also has advantages. Ectothermic animals need much less food than endothermic animals of the same size because they're not burning calories to generate body heat. This means they can survive on less food and can go longer between meals, which is a big advantage in environments where food is unpredictable. The skin of these early amniotes was probably already developing the waterproof qualities that characterize modern reptiles. Reptile skin is covered with scales made of keratin, the same protein that makes up human hair and nails. These scales overlap like shingles on a roof, creating a barrier that prevents water loss. Under the scales is a layer of skin with very few glands, unlike mammalian skin, which has numerous sweat glands and oil glands. This relatively dry, scaly skin is excellent for preventing water loss, but means that reptiles can't cool themselves by evaporation, like mammals can through sweating. The development of waterproof skin was crucial for the colonization of drier environments. Amphibians, with their moist, permeable skin, lose water rapidly and must stay in humid environments or near water. The waterproof skin of amniotes freed them from this constraint, allowing them to venture into areas that were off-limits to amphibians. Diet and feeding strategies were also important factors in the evolution of early amniotes. The earliest forms were probably insectivorous, feeding on the abundant arthropods of the Carboniferous forests. Their teeth were relatively simple and uniform, good for grabbing and holding prey, but not specialized for any particular diet. As amniotes diversified, different lineages began experimenting with different diets and developing specialized teeth to match. Some developed larger, more robust teeth for crushing hard-shelled prey like beetles or snails. Others developed more blade-like teeth for slicing through flesh. Still others began to develop the specialized teeth needed for herbivory, including broad grinding surfaces for processing tough plant material. The evolution of herbivory in vertebrates was a major transition that required numerous adaptations. Plant material, especially the tough, fiber-rich plants of the Carboniferous, is difficult to digest. It requires either mechanical processing to break down the cell walls, chemical processing through fermentation, or both. Early herbivorous amniotes probably had to eat large quantities of plant material to get enough nutrition, and they likely had enlarged guts to accommodate the fermenting vegetation. The split between synapsids and sauropsids was happening around this time, setting up a divergence that would eventually lead to mammals on one branch and reptiles, dinosaurs, and birds on the other. At 300 million years ago, though, these two groups were still pretty similar. You'd have to be a specialist to tell them apart by looking at them, and the main distinguishing feature was the structure of their skulls. Synapsids, which would eventually lead to mammals, had a single opening called a temporal fenestra on each side of the skull behind the eye. This opening provided space for jaw muscles to bulge when contracting, allowing for more powerful bites. Over millions of years, synapsids would develop increasingly sophisticated jaw muscles and more complex teeth, foreshadowing the specialized dentition of mammals. Sauropsids, the other branch, initially had no temporal fenestrae, but some lineages would evolve them later. This group would eventually split into two major branches, one leading to modern reptiles like lizards, snakes, and tuataras, and another leading to archosaurs, the group that includes crocodiles, dinosaurs, and birds. The evolutionary trajectories of these two lineages would diverge dramatically over the next 100 million years. Synapsids would become the dominant large land animals of the Permian period, diversifying into numerous forms, including both herbivores and carnivores. Some would develop increasingly mammal-like features, including differentiated teeth, more upright posture, and possibly even hair and endothermy. Eventually, after surviving the catastrophic end Permian extinction, they'd give rise to true mammals. Sauropsids would have a slower start, remaining relatively small and uncommon through much of the Permian. But after the end Permian extinction cleared away many of the dominant synapsids, sauropsids would get their chance. In the Triassic, they'd diversify explosively, giving rise to turtles, lizards, crocodiles, dinosaurs, and pterosaurs. For the next 160 million years, sauropsids in the form of dinosaurs would be the dominant, large land animals. The pace of evolution is often thought of as gradual and steady, but it's actually quite variable. During periods of environmental stability, evolution tends to be relatively slow, with species adapting incrementally to their environments. But during periods of rapid environmental change or following mass extinctions, when many ecological niches are suddenly vacant, evolution can happen much more quickly as species diversify to fill available niches. 300 million years ago was a time of relatively gradual evolution. The major groups of terrestrial vertebrates were established, and they were slowly diversifying and adapting to different lifestyles. There wasn't a mass extinction happening right then, though one was coming in a few tens of millions of years that would reshape life on Earth. The interactions between different species were complex and constantly evolving. Predator-prey relationships were a major driver of evolution, with prey evolving better defenses and predators evolving better ways to overcome those defenses. This evolutionary arms race can be seen in the fossil record in the form of increasingly sophisticated predatory adaptations and corresponding defensive adaptations. For example, as some predators evolved larger size and more powerful jaws, their prey might have evolved tougher armor or the ability to run faster or hide more effectively. These changes in prey populations would then select for predators that could overcome the new defenses, perhaps by evolving even larger size, more powerful muscles, or different hunting strategies. Competition between species for limited resources was another important selective force. When two species are competing for the same food or living space, natural selection favors individuals that are better at obtaining those resources. Over time, this can lead to character displacement, where competing species evolve to become more different from each other, reducing competition by specializing on different resources. Symbiotic relationships, where different species live in close association with each other, were also evolving. Some of these relationships are mutualistic, where both species benefit. Others are commensal, where one species benefits and the other is unaffected. Still others are parasitic, where one species benefits at the expense of the other. Evidence for symbiotic relationships in the fossil record is hard to come by, because these relationships often don't leave direct physical traces. However, we can make inferences based on modern analogs. For example, many modern plants have mycorrhizal associations with fungi, where the fungi help the plant absorb nutrients from the soil in exchange for sugars produced by photosynthesis. These associations are ancient and probably existed 300 million years ago. Parasites were certainly present and probably common. Fossil evidence of parasites is rare but does exist, including things like parasitic worms preserved in coprolites, fossilized feces. The diversity of parasites in modern ecosystems suggests that ancient ecosystems were similarly full of parasitic relationships. The geology of the period was creating the conditions for the formation of numerous important mineral deposits that would be economically valuable hundreds of millions of years later. The coal deposits have already been mentioned, but they weren't the only important resources being formed. Limestone formation was ongoing in shallow marine environments. Limestone is primarily composed of calcium carbonate, and it forms in several ways. Some limestone is made up of the shells and skeletons of marine organisms that accumulated on the seafloor. When these organisms die, their hard parts settle out and gradually build up thick deposits. Other limestone forms when calcium carbonate precipitates directly from seawater, particularly in warm, shallow tropical seas where the water is supersaturated with calcium carbonate. Limestone is an incredibly important rock for several reasons. It's a major reservoir for carbon, locking away carbon that would otherwise be in the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. It's also economically important as a building material and as a source of lime for cement and numerous industrial processes. The limestone that was forming 300 million years ago is still being quarried and used today in many parts of the world. Iron deposits were also forming in some environments. These weren't the massive banded iron formations that characterize much older rocks from billions of years ago, but smaller deposits, formed by different processes. In swampy environments where organic material was abundant, bacteria could reduce iron compounds, changing them from insoluble forms that remain in the rock to soluble forms that can be transported by water. These iron-rich waters could then deposit their iron in other locations when conditions changed, forming bog iron deposits. Other metallic ores were being concentrated by various geological processes. Hydrothermal activity associated with volcanic systems could concentrate valuable metals like copper, gold, silver, and zinc. When hot, mineral-rich water circulates through rock and then cools or mixes with different water. Metals that were dissolved in the hot water can precipitate out, forming ore deposits. The formation of these mineral deposits is a slow process, often requiring millions of years and the right combination of geological conditions. The deposits that were forming 300 million years ago are now buried under kilometers of younger rock in some places, while in others, they've been uplifted and exposed by later tectonic activity and erosion, making them accessible for mining. The continental collisions that were building Panja were also creating conditions for the formation of petroleum deposits. Petroleum forms from the remains of marine organisms, primarily microscopic plankton that accumulate on the seafloor. When these organic-rich sediments get buried under other sediments, they're subjected to heat and pressure. At certain depths, where the temperature is in the right range, typically around 60 to 120 degrees Celsius, the organic material is transformed into liquid petroleum. The petroleum doesn't just stay where it forms, though. It's less dense than water and the surrounding rock, so it tends to migrate upward through permeable rock layers. If it encounters an impermeable layer like shale, it can accumulate beneath that layer, forming a petroleum reservoir. The largest petroleum reservoirs are found in structural traps, where the geometry of the rock layers prevents the petroleum from continuing to migrate upward. 300 million years ago, organic-rich sediments were accumulating in various marine environments, sediments that would eventually become petroleum source rocks. The petroleum itself wouldn't form until these sediments were buried and heated, a process that would take tens of millions of years. Some of this petroleum is still in the ground today, forming oil fields that supply a significant portion of the world's energy needs. Natural gas, primarily methane, forms in similar environments to petroleum, but generally requires higher temperatures. Much of the natural gas we use today comes from the same source rocks and reservoir rocks as petroleum, just from deeper, hotter parts of the sedimentary basins. The water cycle 300 million years ago was operating much as it does today. with water evaporating from the oceans, being transported by winds, falling as precipitation on land, and flowing back to the ocean in rivers. However, the configuration of land and ocean was different, so the specific patterns of precipitation and runoff were different. Evaporation rates were probably high given the warm global climate. This means that huge amounts of water were being cycled through the atmosphere. In areas with heavy precipitation, this led to the formation of the vast swamps and wetlands where coal was accumulating. In areas with low precipitation, perhaps in the rain shadows of mountain ranges or in continental interiors, dry conditions led to very different types of ecosystems. The rivers of 300 million years ago were shaped by the landscape they flowed through. In mountainous areas, rivers would have been fast-flowing with steep gradients, cutting deep valleys through the rock. These mountain streams would have been relatively straight and would have carried lots of sediment eroded from the surrounding peaks. As rivers emerged from the mountains onto flatter lowlands, their character changed. The gradient decreased, the flow slowed, and the rivers began to meander, creating sinuous channels that wandered back and forth across broad floodplains. During floods, these rivers would overflow their banks, depositing sediment across the floodplain and creating fertile soils. Near the coast, rivers often split into multiple channels, creating deltas where sediment accumulated in thick deposits. These deltas were dynamic environments, constantly changing as channels shifted and new land was built out into the ocean. They were also highly productive ecosystems, benefiting from nutrients brought down by the river and supporting diverse communities of plants and animals. The atmosphere 300 million years ago would have looked similar to today's if you could see it from space, though the patterns of clouds would have been different due to the different arrangement of land and ocean. Close to the surface, though, there would have been some noticeable differences. The high oxygen concentration would have affected combustion. Fires would have burned hotter and faster than they do today, and materials that are hard to ignite in modern air might have burned readily. This has implications for the role of fire in ancient ecosystems. Lightning strikes would have started fires, and these fires could have spread rapidly through dry vegetation. However, fire probably wasn't as common in the coal swamps as it was in drier areas. The wet conditions in the swamps would have made it hard for fires to start or spread. In contrast, drier upland areas with coniferous or seed fern vegetation might have experienced frequent fires during dry seasons. Some plants were probably already evolving adaptations to fire. Thick bark that protects the living tissues beneath from heat damage, the ability to re-sprout from roots after the above-ground parts are burned, and seeds that are triggered to germinate by fire are all adaptations seen in modern fire-adapted ecosystems, and some of these might have been present 300 million years ago. The nights 300 million years ago would have been something to see. Without any artificial light pollution, the sky would have been incredibly dark away from any natural sources of light like fires or bioluminescent organisms. The stars would have been brilliant, thousands visible to the naked eye, far more than can be seen from most places on modern Earth. The constellations, of course, would have been different. Stars are moving through space at different speeds and in different directions, and over 300 million years, they've changed their positions significantly relative to each other. The Big Dipper, Orion, and all the other familiar patterns we see today wouldn't have existed. The sky would have shown completely different patterns that no human has ever seen. The Milky Way would have been a spectacular band of light arcing across the sky, just as it is today in truly dark locations. Our solar system's position within the galaxy hasn't changed much over 300 million years, so the basic appearance of the Milky Way would have been similar, though the individual stars making up that glow would have been different. The moon would have been noticeably closer to Earth than it is today. The moon is gradually moving away from Earth at a rate of about 3.8 centimeters per year due to tidal interactions. Over 300 million years, that adds up to about 11,000 kilometers. That might not sound like much compared to the current Earth-Moon distance of about 384,000 kilometers, but it's enough to make the moon appear slightly larger in the sky. More importantly, A closer moon meant stronger tides. Tides are caused by the gravitational pull of the moon and sun on Earth's oceans, and the strength of tidal forces decreases rapidly with distance. With the moon closer, tides would have been higher, with a bigger difference between high tide and low tide. This would have had significant effects on coastal ecosystems, creating more extensive intertidal zones and stronger tidal currents. The length of the day was also slightly different 300 million years ago. Earth's rotation is gradually slowing down due to tidal friction, an effect of the same Moon-Earth tidal interactions that are pushing the moon away. 300 million years ago, a day was probably about 22 to 23 hours long instead of 24. This shorter day might seem like a small difference, but it would have had subtle effects on daily rhythms of temperature and on the behavior of organisms. Animals with circadian rhythms, internal biological clocks that regulate daily patterns of activity, would have been synchronized to this slightly shorter day-night cycle. The year, however, would have been the same length as today because that's determined by Earth's orbit around the Sun, which hasn't changed significantly. This means that a year would have contained more days, roughly 395 or so, instead of 365. The extra days would have been distributed across the seasons, making each season slightly longer in terms of days, though not in terms of total time. The position of the continents relative to latitude would have affected how seasons were experienced in different places. Areas near the equator would have had minimal seasonal variation, with day length staying close to 12 hours year-round and temperatures staying relatively constant. Higher latitudes would have experienced more dramatic seasonal changes, with long summer days and short winter days, and corresponding changes in temperature. The tilt of Earth's axis, which is what causes seasons, was probably similar to today's value of about 23.5 degrees. This tilt means that during part of the year, the northern hemisphere is tilted toward the sun, receiving more direct sunlight and experiencing summer, while the southern hemisphere is tilted away, experiencing winter. 6 months later, the situation is reversed. The southern parts of Gondwana, which were located over the South Pole, would have experienced extreme seasonal variations. During the southern summer, these areas would have had continuous daylight, with the sun circling the horizon without setting. The ice sheets would have been subject to some melting, though temperatures probably didn't get warm enough for extensive melting except at the edges. During the southern winter, these polar regions would have been plunged into continuous darkness, with temperatures dropping to extreme lows. Any life that existed in these harsh conditions would have needed special adaptations to survive. Some organisms might have migrated to more hospitable areas during winter, while others might have gone dormant, essentially hibernating through the dark months. The northern parts of the continents, while not over the North Pole, would still have experienced cold conditions at high latitudes, particularly in mountainous areas. However, without extensive ice sheets in the north, conditions were probably less extreme than in the south. Weather patterns 300 million years ago would have been governed by the same basic physical principles that govern weather today. Differential heating of Earth's surface, the Coriolis effect, and the properties of air and water. However, the specific patterns would have been different due to the different distribution of land and ocean. Hurricanes, or their equivalent, would have formed in tropical oceans, particularly in the late summer and fall when sea surface temperatures were highest. These massive, rotating storms are driven by the energy from warm ocean water, and they'd have been just as powerful and destructive 300 million years ago as they are today. When they made landfall, they'd have brought torrential rains, strong winds, and storm surges that could penetrate far inland, especially in flat coastal areas. Thunderstorms would have been common, especially in areas with strong daytime heating and abundant moisture. The process of thunderstorm formation hasn't changed. Warm, moist air rises, cools, and the water vapor condenses, releasing heat that makes the air rise even faster. This creates a self-reinforcing cycle that builds towering cumulonimbus clouds that can reach heights of over 15 kilometers. Lightning would have been just as spectacular and dangerous as it is today. The high oxygen concentration might have actually made lightning strikes even more likely to start fires than they are in modern atmospheres. A lightning strike in dry vegetation during a drought could start a fire that had spread rapidly through the landscape. Tornadoes probably occurred, though they might have been less common than in modern North America, which has a unique geography that makes it particularly prone to tornado formation. Tornadoes form when there's strong wind shear, a change in wind direction or speed with height, combined with instability in the atmosphere. The specific conditions required for tornado formation depend on the interaction of different air masses, so the frequency and locations of tornadoes would have depended on the continental configuration and atmospheric circulation patterns. Rain would have had the same character as modern rain, falling as drops that could range from tiny drizzle to heavy downpours. The sound of rain falling on the ancient forests, on the leaves of giant lycopods and tree ferns, would have been familiar. The smell of rain on dry ground, caused by organic compounds released when raindrops hit the soil, probably existed then too. Snow and ice would have been common at high latitudes and in mountainous areas. Snowflakes would have formed in clouds just as they do today, with water vapor freezing into intricate crystalline structures. The snow that accumulated in mountains would have formed glaciers in some areas, rivers of ice that flow slowly downhill under their own weight, carving valleys and depositing distinctive landforms. The impact of climate on the distribution of life was profound. Different organisms were adapted to different climate zones, and climate change, whether on seasonal timescales or longer geological timescales, forced organisms to either adapt, migrate, or go extinct. The ongoing formation of Panja was causing climate changes on a massive scale. As the continents came together and the Rheic Ocean closed, ocean circulation patterns changed. The configuration of land affected where warm ocean currents flowed and where cold currents flowed, which in turn affected the climates of adjacent land areas. The creation of the central Pangean mountains affected precipitation patterns by creating rain shadows. Moisture-laden winds blowing in from the ocean would rise over the mountains, cool, and drop their moisture on the windward side. By the time the air descended on the leeward side, it was dry, creating arid conditions. These climatic changes were gradual on human timescales, taking hundreds of thousands or millions of years, but they were fast enough to exert strong selective pressure on organisms. Populations that found themselves in changing environments had to adapt or move. Those that couldn't do either went extinct. The coal swamp forests that were so extensive 300 million years ago would eventually decline as the climate became drier and the continents fully assembled into Pangea. The plants that dominated these swamps were adapted to wet conditions and didn't do well in drier environments. As their habitat shrank, many of these species would go extinct or become restricted to small refuges where conditions remained favorable. This decline of the coal swamps would have cascading effects through the ecosystem. The animals that depended on these forests, whether directly as herbivores or indirectly as predators, would have to adapt to changing conditions. Some lineages would decline along with the forests. Others would adapt to new environments and would thrive. The seed plants, particularly conifers and seed ferns, were better adapted to drier conditions than the spore-bearing plants of the coal swamps. As the climate became drier moving into the Permian period, these seed plants would become increasingly important components of terrestrial ecosystems. They'd form forests in upland areas and would eventually colonize areas where coal swamps had previously existed. The animals of 300 million years ago were engaged in a constant struggle for survival. Every day brought the need to find food, to avoid becoming food, to find mates, and to deal with environmental challenges ranging from extreme weather to changing seasons. Predators had to be efficient hunters because every hunt required energy, and failed hunts meant that energy was wasted. Natural selection favored predators that were good at finding prey, capturing it efficiently, and not getting injured in the process. Different predators evolved different strategies. Some were pursuit predators, chasing down their prey over distance. These predators needed stamina and speed. Their bodies would have been relatively lightweight and streamlined, their limbs adapted for running. Their senses, particularly vision, would have been acute to help them track prey over distance. Other predators were ambush hunters, waiting in cover and striking when prey came close. These predators needed patience, camouflage, and explosive speed over short distances. Their bodies might have been heavier and more powerful than pursuit predators, built for short bursts of intense effort rather than sustained running. Still, other predators were opportunistic scavengers, feeding on animals that had died from other causes or stealing kills from other predators. This strategy required less energy than active hunting, but meant dealing with competition from other scavengers and accepting whatever food was available. Prey animals had their own survival strategies. Some relied on camouflage, trying to avoid being detected in the first place. Their coloration and patterns would have helped them blend into their surroundings. They'd have needed to stay still when predators were near, since movement draws attention. Others relied on vigilance and early detection, keeping watch for predators and fleeing when they were spotted. These animals often had eyes positioned on the sides of their heads, giving them a wide field of view so they could see predators approaching from almost any direction. They also often lived in groups, where multiple individuals could watch for danger. Some prey animals had physical defenses like armor, spines, or tough shells that made them difficult or dangerous for predators to attack. These defenses weren't foolproof, but they increased the cost of attacking, which might make a predator decide to look for easier prey. Speed was another common defense. Animals that could outrun predators obviously had a significant advantage. This led to evolutionary arms races, where predators evolved to become faster and prey evolved to become faster still, with both sides constantly under selective pressure to improve. Chemical defenses were probably used by some animals, though direct evidence is hard to come by in the fossil record. Modern insects and amphibians often have toxic compounds in their skin or body fluids that make them unpalatable or poisonous to predators. Similar defenses might have existed 300 million years ago. Warning coloration, where toxic or dangerous animals have bright, conspicuous patterns that advertise their defenses, probably existed as well. This type of coloration is common in modern poisonous frogs and toxic insects, and there's no reason to think it wasn't equally effective in the Carboniferous. Some animals might have used mimicry, where harmless species evolved to resemble dangerous or unpalatable species, gaining protection from predators without actually having to invest in chemical defenses. This strategy works because predators learn to avoid prey with certain appearance patterns after a few bad experiences. Reproductive strategies were incredibly diverse, as they are in modern ecosystems. Different organisms faced different challenges and opportunities in reproducing, and evolution shaped their reproductive biology accordingly. Many invertebrates were highly prolific, producing huge numbers of offspring with very little parental care. The strategy here was to overwhelm predators with sheer numbers. If you produce thousands or millions of offspring, even if the vast majority die, enough might survive to maintain the population. The downside of this strategy is that each individual offspring gets very little parental investment. They're on their own from the moment they're born or hatched, and they have to survive on their own. This works okay for simple organisms that mature quickly, but it's less suitable for complex organisms that require a long period of development. Vertebrates generally invested more in each offspring, producing fewer babies, but giving them a better start in life. Amphibians still produced large numbers of eggs, but they chose their breeding sites carefully to maximize the survival chances of their larvae. The eggs were often laid in masses or strings and left to develop on their own, though some amphibians might have guarded their eggs, or even their larvae. The evolution of the amniotic egg represented a major shift in reproductive strategy. The egg itself represented a significant investment of resources by the parent, particularly the yolk, which provided nutrition for the developing embryo. The shell and membranes protected the embryo from drying out, and from many predators and parasites. Some amniotes probably provided parental care beyond just producing eggs. They might have guarded their eggs to protect them from predators and might have selected safe nesting sites. The evolution of extended parental care, where parents actively feed and protect their offspring after hatching, would come later, but the groundwork was being laid. Mating strategies varied widely. Some species were promiscuous, with males mating with as many females as possible, and females mating with multiple males. This strategy maximizes the number of offspring for successful males, but means males have to compete intensely with each other for mating opportunities. Other species were more monogamous, with pairs staying together for a breeding season or even longer. This strategy can allow for more parental cooperation in raising offspring, but requires mechanisms for maintaining the pair bond. Sexual selection, where individuals compete for mates or where one sex chooses mates based on certain characteristics, was shaping the evolution of many species. Males often had to compete with other males for access to females, leading to the evolution of weapons like horns or larger size and strength. Alternatively, females might choose mates based on particular traits, leading to the evolution of elaborate displays or ornaments. The evidence for these behaviors in extinct organisms is limited because behavior usually doesn't fossilize. However, we can make inferences based on anatomy and on comparisons with modern organisms. If we find evidence of sexual dimorphism, where males and females look different, it suggests that sexual selection was operating. Communication between individuals was important for coordination of mating, for maintaining group cohesion, for warning of predators, and for establishing territories. Different species used different communication channels: sounds, visual signals, chemical signals, and possibly even tactile signals. Sounds would have been common. Many insects produce sounds by rubbing body parts together, a behavior called stridulation. The familiar chirping of crickets is produced this way. 300 million years ago, various insects were probably making similar sounds, though we can't know exactly what they sounded like. Amphibians can vocalize using their larynx, and modern frogs and toads are famously noisy, especially during breeding season. Ancient amphibians might have been equally vocal. The calls might have been used to attract mates, to establish territories, or to coordinate activities. Whether early amniotes could vocalize is uncertain. Modern reptiles can make sounds, but they're generally not as vocal as amphibians or mammals. However, some lizards and crocodilians are quite vocal, so it's possible that some early amniotes were too. Visual signals could include body postures, movements, and possibly coloration. Many modern lizards use head bobbing and dewlap displays to communicate, and similar behaviors might have existed in early amniotes. Color changes, like those seen in chameleons and some other modern reptiles, might have been present in some species. Chemical communication using pheromones was probably widespread. Modern insects rely heavily on pheromones for finding mates, marking trails, warning of danger, and many other functions. Given how successful this communication channel is, it's virtually certain that it was being used 300 million years ago as well. The sense organs of these ancient animals would have been adapted to their particular lifestyles and environments. Vision was important for many animals, particularly those that were active during the day. The compound eyes of arthropods, made up of hundreds or thousands of individual visual units called ommatidia, were well developed and provided good visual acuity and motion detection. The eyes of vertebrates were structurally different, but functionally similar to those of modern vertebrates. They had a lens to focus light, a retina to detect light, and neural processing to interpret the visual information. Color vision probably existed in at least some species, allowing them to distinguish different wavelengths of light. Hearing was important for detecting sounds, including the calls of potential mates, the approach of predators, and environmental sounds like thunder that might signal approaching storms. The auditory systems of ancient tetrapods were probably simpler than those of modern mammals, but still effective for detecting and localizing sounds. The sense of smell was crucial for many animals, allowing them to detect food, predators, mates, and other individuals. Olfaction works by detecting specific molecules in the air or water, and it can be incredibly sensitive. Some modern animals can detect certain odors at concentrations of just a few molecules per trillion. Touch, mediated by various types of sensory receptors in the skin, provided information about the immediate environment. Tactile sensation helped animals navigate through dense vegetation, detect the texture of surfaces, and respond to contact with other individuals. Some animals might have had additional sensory abilities that humans lack. Various modern animals can detect electric fields, magnetic fields, infrared radiation, or ultraviolet light. We don't have direct evidence for these abilities in Carboniferous animals, but they're so widespread in modern animals that at least some ancient lineages probably had them too. The process of fossilization was creating the record that would eventually allow future paleontologists to piece together what life was like 300 million years ago. Fossilization is a rare event, requiring a specific set of circumstances, and the fossil record is therefore incomplete, representing only a tiny fraction of the organisms that lived and died. For an organism to become fossilized, it typically needs to be buried quickly after death, before it can be completely consumed by scavengers or decomposed by bacteria. This usually happens in aquatic environments where sediment is constantly being deposited. An animal that dies in a river or lake might sink to the bottom and get covered by mud before it has time to decay completely. Marine environments are even better for fossilization because sedimentation rates can be high, and the conditions often exclude oxygen, which slows decomposition. The shallow seas 300 million years ago were depositing thick layers of mud and sand, and the organisms that died and sank into this sediment had a decent chance of being preserved. On land, fossilization is much rarer. Dead organisms are usually consumed or decomposed quickly in terrestrial environments. However, animals that died in or near water, like amphibians that died in ponds, or animals that drowned in floods, could be buried by sediment and preserved. Once buried, the organic material in bones, shells, and other hard parts can be replaced by minerals dissolved in groundwater, a process called permineralization. The mineral that most commonly replaces original tissues is silica, but calcite, pyrite, and other minerals can also do the job. This replacement happens molecule by molecule, and it can preserve incredible detail, including microscopic structures. In some cases, the original material dissolves away completely, leaving a mold, a cavity in the rock that has the shape of the original organism. If this mold later fills with minerals, it creates a cast, a replica of the original organism made of entirely different material. Soft tissues rarely fossilize because they decay quickly and don't have the structural stability of hard tissues. However, under exceptional circumstances, soft tissues can be preserved. This typically requires very rapid burial in fine-grained sediment that excludes oxygen, preventing decay. Some of the most spectacular fossils are those that preserve soft tissues, giving us glimpses of things like skin texture, internal organs, or even the contents of stomachs. Trace fossils are another important category. These are not the remains of organisms themselves, but evidence of their activity. Footprints, burrows, bite marks, and coprolites all fall into this category. Trace fossils can tell us things about behavior that we can't learn from body fossils alone, like how an animal moved, what it ate, or how it interacted with its environment. The coal deposits forming 300 million years ago are themselves a type of fossil, preserving the remains of the plants that made up the coal swamps. While individual plant structures are often not recognizable in coal, sometimes plant fossils are found in the rock layers associated with coal seams, preserved in exquisite detail. The information preserved in fossils is our only direct window into the past. Without fossils, we'd have no way of knowing what ancient life was like. We could make theoretical predictions based on evolution and geology, but we couldn't know for sure what actually existed. The study of fossils, paleontology, has revealed an incredible amount about the history of life on Earth. By carefully excavating fossils, documenting their position in the rock layers, and analyzing their anatomy, paleontologists can reconstruct ancient organisms and ancient ecosystems in remarkable detail. Different types of fossils tell us different things. Body fossils tell us about anatomy, what an organism looked like and how it was built. Trace fossils tell us about behavior, how organisms moved and interacted with their environment. The distribution of fossils in space tells us about biogeography, which organisms lived where. The distribution of fossils in time, through different layers of rock, tells us about evolution, how organisms changed over time. The rock layers themselves provide crucial context. The principle of superposition states that in undisturbed sedimentary rocks, older layers are on the bottom and younger layers are on top. This allows geologists to determine the relative ages of different fossils. If fossil A is found in a layer below fossil B, then fossil A is older. Radiometric dating provides absolute ages. Certain radioactive isotopes decay at known rates, and by measuring the ratios of parent isotopes to daughter isotopes in rocks, geologists can calculate how long ago the rock formed. This allows fossils to be dated with increasing precision. The 300-million-year-old rocks are old enough that they can be dated reliably using several different radiometric systems. Uranium-lead dating works well for this time period, as does argon-argon dating in appropriate rock types. The dates obtained from different methods usually agree within the margin of error, giving confidence in the ages. By combining fossils with radiometric dates and with information about ancient environments preserved in the rocks, scientists can build up a detailed picture of what Earth was like at any particular time. The picture is never complete, because fossilization is rare and much information is lost. But it's surprisingly detailed considering that we're looking back hundreds of millions of years. The coal swamps of 300 million years ago were economically important long before humans existed, because they were producing the coal that would power the Industrial Revolution. But they were also ecologically important at the time, because they were incredibly productive ecosystems that supported enormous amounts of biomass. Productivity in an ecosystem refers to the rate at which energy is captured by photosynthesis and converted into organic matter. In highly productive ecosystems, plants grow rapidly and produce large amounts of biomass, which in turn supports large populations of herbivores and the predators that feed on them. The coal swamps were highly productive because they had everything plants need: abundant sunlight, warm temperatures, plenty of water, and nutrients from the weathering of rocks. The plants in these swamps grew rapidly, and the year-round favorable conditions meant that growth wasn't limited to a short growing season. This high productivity supported complex food webs with many species at different trophic levels. At the base were the plants, capturing solar energy through photosynthesis. Herbivorous insects and other arthropods fed on the plants, converting plant biomass into animal biomass. Predatory arthropods and small vertebrates fed on the herbivores. Larger predators fed on these smaller predators. At the top were the apex predators, the largest carnivorous amphibians that had no natural enemies except each other. Energy flows through ecosystems, moving from one trophic level to the next. However, each transfer is inefficient. Only about 10% of the energy at one level makes it to the next level. The other 90% is lost as heat through metabolism, or isn't captured because not all organisms get eaten. This inefficiency of energy transfer is why food chains are usually short, with only 4 or 5 levels. There's simply not enough energy left to support additional levels. It's also why there are fewer predators than prey. A given area of habitat might support many herbivores, but only a few top predators, because so much energy is lost between the herbivore level and the predator level. The cycling of nutrients is equally important to ecosystem function. Unlike energy, which flows through ecosystems in one direction, from the sun to producers to consumers, nutrients cycle through ecosystems repeatedly. Carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and other essential elements are taken up by plants, passed to animals that eat the plants, return to the environment when organisms die and decompose, and then taken up by plants again. Decomposers play a crucial role in nutrient cycling. These organisms, primarily bacteria and fungi, break down dead organic matter and release nutrients back into the environment, where they can be used by plants. Without decomposers, Nutrients would be locked up in dead tissues and unavailable to living organisms. The relatively slow decomposition of woody material in the Carboniferous period meant that nutrients were being tied up in partially decayed plant matter and in the peat that was accumulating. This might have actually limited productivity in some areas by making nutrients less available. However, the overall abundance of nutrients from rock weathering probably compensated for this. The Carboniferous period is named after the carbon that was buried in coal deposits during this time. This burial of carbon had a profound effect on the global carbon cycle. Carbon that would normally have been returned to the atmosphere through decomposition was instead locked away in sedimentary rocks. The removal of carbon from the active carbon cycle, the atmosphere-ocean biosphere system, caused atmospheric carbon dioxide levels to drop. This decrease in carbon dioxide, a greenhouse gas, contributed to global cooling and probably played a role in the expansion of the ice sheets at the South Pole. This is a great example of how the biosphere can affect the physical environment on a global scale. The organisms in the coal swamps weren't trying to change the global climate. They were just growing and dying as organisms do. But the collective effect of all those organisms, combined with the slow decomposition that allowed their remains to accumulate, ended up altering the atmosphere and climate of the entire planet. These kinds of feedbacks between life and the physical environment are common in Earth's history. Life doesn't just passively respond to environmental conditions. It actively shapes those conditions. The Great Oxidation Event 2 billion years ago, when photosynthetic organisms pumped oxygen into the atmosphere, is another dramatic example. That event completely transformed Earth's atmosphere and set the stage for the evolution of complex life. The world 300 million years ago was a world in transition. The geography was changing as continents collided to form Panja. The climate was changing as carbon burial altered atmospheric composition. Life was evolving, with new groups like the amniotes just beginning to diversify, and older groups like certain amphibian lineages still dominant. This transitional nature is typical of Earth's history. The planet is never static. It's always changing in response to the constant interplay of geological, atmospheric, oceanic, and biological processes. Some changes are gradual, like the slow drift of continents. Others are rapid, like volcanic eruptions or meteor impacts. The organisms living 300 million years ago had no way of knowing that they were living in what we'd later call the Late Carboniferous, or that their world was about to undergo dramatic changes in the Permian period. They were just living their lives, trying to survive and reproduce in an environment that was all they'd ever known. In some ways, their world was alien to modern eyes. The dominant plants were giant lycopods and tree ferns rather than flowering plants. The dominant animals on land were amphibians and early amniotes rather than mammals or birds. The atmosphere had more oxygen and more carbon dioxide than today. The continents were in different positions, but in other ways, their world was familiar. The sun rose and set each day, driven by Earth's rotation. Rain fell from clouds. Rivers flowed to the sea. Predators hunted prey. Parents produced offspring. Life continued, generation after generation, shaped by the same evolutionary processes that operate today. The individuals that lived 300 million years ago are long gone, their bodies preserved as fossils, or more commonly, lost without a trace. But their legacy lives on in multiple ways. The coal they formed powers our civilization. The fossils they left behind teach us about evolution and Earth history. And most fundamentally, they're our ancestors. Every vertebrate alive today, every mammal, bird, and reptile, is descended from some small amniote that lived in that ancient world. Understanding this deep history is important for several reasons. It gives us perspective on our own place in the grand sweep of Earth's history. Humans have only been around for a few million years, and modern humans for a few 100,000. That's a blink of an eye compared to the 3.5 billion year history of life on Earth. It also helps us understand how Earth's systems work. By studying past climate changes, we can better understand current climate change. By studying past extinction events, we can better understand the threats facing biodiversity today. By studying how life has responded to environmental changes in the past, we can make better predictions about how it will respond to future changes. The world of 300 million years ago was just as real as the world today. The sun shone just as brightly, though on a different landscape. The rain fell just as hard, though on different forests. Animals lived and died, ate and were eaten, reproduced and went extinct. The world was full and alive, teeming with organisms that had been shaped by hundreds of millions of years of evolution and that were continuing to evolve in response to their changing environment. Walking through one of those ancient coal forests would have been an unforgettable experience. The humidity would have been oppressive, the air thick and heavy. The sounds would have been strange. The buzz of giant insects, the calls of amphibians, the rustle of small amniotes in the undergrowth, the creak and groan of trees in the wind. The smells would have been intense. The rich organic smell of decomposing vegetation, the scent of living plants, the musky smell of animals. The light filtering through the canopy would have been green-tinted and dappled, creating patches of sunlight and shadow on the forest floor. Every surface would have been covered with life. Mosses and small ferns carpeted the ground. Larger ferns formed an understory. The trunks of the giant lycopods would have been covered with epiphytic plants, small plants that grow on other plants without parasitizing them. Insects would have been everywhere, crawling on every surface, flying through the air. The forest would have been dynamic, constantly changing. Trees would fall, creating gaps in the canopy where light could reach the forest floor, spurring growth of new vegetation. Rivers would change course, creating new wetlands and abandoning old channels. Fires, though probably rare in the wettest areas, would occasionally sweep through drier patches, clearing vegetation and resetting succession. Seasonal changes, even in tropical areas, would have been evident. Wet seasons and dry seasons would have affected water levels and plant growth. Some plants might have been deciduous, dropping their leaves during unfavorable seasons. Animal activity patterns would have changed with the seasons, with breeding concentrated in favorable times of year. The passage of years would have brought longer-term changes. Climate varied on decadal and centennial timescales just as it does today, with some periods being wetter or drier, warmer or cooler than average. These variations would have affected the composition and structure of the forests, favoring some species during wet periods and others during dry periods. Over thousands and millions of years, the changes would have been more dramatic. The continents continued their slow collision, building mountains and changing ocean circulation patterns. The climate gradually shifted as atmospheric composition changed. Species evolved, new ones appearing and old ones going extinct. The forests that existed 300 million years ago were not exactly the same as those that existed 10 million years earlier, or 10 million years later. This constant change, operating on multiple timescales from daily to millions of years, is the backdrop against which evolution operates. Natural selection favors individuals that are well adapted to their current environment, but the environment is always changing. This creates an evolutionary ratchet where organisms are constantly evolving to catch up with changing conditions. Sometimes the pace of environmental change is slow enough that evolution can keep up, with populations gradually shifting their characteristics to match the changing environment. Other times, change is too rapid or too extreme, and populations can't adapt quickly enough. That's when extinctions happen. The fossil record shows numerous extinction events throughout Earth's history, times when many species went extinct in a geologically short period. Some of these extinctions were caused by catastrophic events like meteor impacts or massive volcanic eruptions. Others were caused by more gradual environmental changes that pushed species beyond their limits. 300 million years ago, life was recovering from the late Devonian extinctions that had occurred about 50 million years earlier. Those extinctions had particularly affected marine life, but terrestrial ecosystems were also impacted. In the time since, Diversity had been rebuilding as surviving lineages diversified to fill vacant niches. The world was stable enough that this diversification could occur, but not so stable that evolution stopped. The sweet spot for promoting biodiversity seems to be intermediate levels of environmental change. Too much change and extinctions exceed speciation, causing diversity to decline. Too little change, and there's not enough selective pressure or ecological opportunity for new species to evolve. The interconnectedness of life 300 million years ago was profound, with countless relationships between species creating a web of dependencies that held ecosystems together. No organism lived in isolation. Each was connected to many others through direct interactions like predation and competition, and through indirect interactions mediated by shared resources or shared enemies. These ecological relationships created a kind of stability through complexity. When many species are connected in a web, the loss of one species can be buffered by the presence of others that can fill similar roles. If a particular prey species becomes rare, predators that feed on it can switch to alternative prey. If a particular predator is removed, other predators can expand their populations to take advantage of the newly available food. However, this stability has limits. If too many species are lost, or if keystone species that play particularly important roles are removed, the whole ecosystem can collapse. Keystone species are those whose impact on the ecosystem is disproportionate to their abundance. Their removal can trigger cascading effects throughout the food web. In the coal forests, some of the large, predatory amphibians might have been keystone species. By preying on herbivores, they'd have kept herbivore populations in check, preventing overgrazing that could damage plant communities. If these predators were removed, herbivore populations might explode, leading to destruction of vegetation, which in turn would affect all the other species that depend on that vegetation. The concept of ecosystem engineers is also relevant here. These are species that physically modify the environment in ways that affect other species. Beavers are a classic example in modern ecosystems, building dams that create ponds and wetlands. 300 million years ago, there probably weren't any vertebrate ecosystem engineers with that kind of impact, but plants certainly filled this role. The giant lycopods and tree ferns that dominated the coal swamps were ecosystem engineers on a massive scale. Their growth created the forest structure that provided habitat for countless other species. Their leaf litter and fallen logs created conditions for decomposers and detritivores. Their roots stabilized soil and affected water flow. Their presence affected local climate by creating humidity and shade. When these plants died and accumulated as peat, they were literally building new land, raising the elevation of the swamp floor. Over time, this accumulation could transform a deep swamp into a shallower marsh, or even eventually into dry land, driving a process called succession, where one community of organisms gradually replaces another. Ecological succession was an important process shaping landscapes. Primary succession occurred on newly formed land, like volcanic islands or areas exposed by retreating glaciers. The first colonizers would be tough, adaptable species that could survive in harsh conditions with little soil and few nutrients. These pioneers would gradually modify the environment, building soil, adding organic matter, and creating conditions where other species could survive. Secondary succession occurred in areas where an existing ecosystem had been disturbed or destroyed, but where soil and some organisms remained. This might happen after a fire, a flood, or a windstorm that knocked down trees. The recovery would be faster than primary succession because the basic ingredients for an ecosystem, soil and propagules of various species, were already present. In the coal swamps, succession might have occurred when rivers changed course, abandoning some areas that would gradually dry out, while creating new swamps in other areas. The species composition would shift as aquatic and semi-aquatic plants were replaced by species adapted to drier conditions. The animals would shift too, with amphibians becoming less common and early amniotes more common as the habitat became less suitable for organisms tied to water. The patchwork of different successional stages across a landscape created habitat diversity, which in turn supported species diversity. Some species were specialists that required early successional habitats. Others needed late successional habitats, and still others needed the interfaces between different habitat types. Edge effects, where different habitat types meet, often support particularly high diversity because species from both habitats can coexist in a relatively small area. Plus, there are often unique species that specifically exploit edge environments. The boundaries between the coal swamps and drier upland areas would have been edges with distinctive communities. The diversity of life 300 million years ago was impressive, though probably not as high as today's diversity in the most diverse modern ecosystems, like tropical rainforests or coral reefs. The evolution of flowering plants in the Cretaceous would eventually lead to an explosion of diversity in terrestrial ecosystems, and we haven't reached that point yet. However, the coal forests and their associated ecosystems were far from simple. There were hundreds or thousands of species of plants, probably tens of thousands of species of arthropods, and numerous species of vertebrates. The exact numbers are impossible to know because the fossil record only preserves a fraction of the species that existed, and many species leave no fossils at all. Extinction is the ultimate fate of all species. The average lifespan of a species in the fossil record is somewhere around 1 to 10 million years, depending on the group. Some species last much longer, others much shorter. But eventually, every species either goes extinct or evolves into something different enough to be considered a new species. The species that existed 300 million years ago are all gone now, either extinct or evolved into modern forms. The amphibians of the Carboniferous coal swamps have no living descendants that look anything like them. The giant lycopods and tree ferns are gone too, though their distant relatives, the small club mosses and ferns, survive. However, the early amniotes of 300 million years ago were the ancestors of all modern reptiles, birds, and mammals, including humans. Somewhere in those coal forests was a small, unremarkable-looking creature, probably no bigger than a rat. That was our direct ancestor. If we could go back and find it, it wouldn't look particularly special. But that creature's descendants would go on to conquer every terrestrial habitat on Earth, from deserts to ice sheets, and eventually to develop intelligence, culture, and technology. The path from that small amniote to modern humans was long and not at all inevitable. Many things had to go right. The lineage had to survive numerous extinction events, including the end Permian extinction that killed over 90% of species. It had to compete successfully with other lineages, particularly the dinosaurs that dominated for over 150 million years. It had to adapt to changing environments again and again, but somehow the lineage persisted. Through the Permian period when synapsids were the dominant large land animals, through the Triassic when dinosaurs emerged and began to take over, through the Jurassic and Cretaceous when mammals were small, mostly nocturnal creatures living in the shadows of the dinosaurs, through the end Cretaceous extinction that killed the dinosaurs, and finally, through the Cenozoic era when mammals diversified explosively, and some lineages grew large and eventually developed big brains. The world of 300 million years ago was the starting point for this incredible journey. The innovations that evolved then, the amniotic egg, the waterproof skin, the more efficient respiratory systems, were crucial for everything that came later. Without those adaptations, vertebrates might never have fully conquered the land. The oxygen-rich atmosphere of the Carboniferous was a temporary condition, a quirk of the planet's state at that particular time. As the coal swamps declined and decomposition evolved to become more efficient, oxygen levels would drop back to more typical values. But during that window of time when oxygen was abundant, it allowed experiments with body size that wouldn't be possible otherwise. The giant arthropods of the Carboniferous couldn't survive in today's atmosphere. Their respiratory systems just aren't efficient enough to supply a large body with oxygen at modern atmospheric concentrations. When oxygen levels dropped in the Permian and beyond, these giants went extinct, and arthropods never again reached such impressive sizes, at least not on land. This is a reminder that what's possible in evolution depends on the environmental context. In different conditions, different body plans and strategies are favored. The history of life isn't just about organisms adapting to a fixed environment. It's about the coevolution of life and environment, with each shaping the other. The coal that was forming in those ancient swamps would have far-reaching consequences that the organisms creating it couldn't possibly have anticipated. That coal would sit buried for hundreds of millions of years, slowly being transformed by heat and pressure into the black rock that burns so readily. Then, in the blink of an eye in geological terms, a species that didn't even exist yet, that wouldn't exist for another 299.8 million years, would dig up that coal and burn it, releasing the stored energy and the stored carbon back into the atmosphere. In just a few centuries, humans would undo what took millions of years to accomplish, taking carbon that had been locked away in the lithosphere and putting it back into the atmosphere. This massive release of carbon dioxide is changing Earth's climate, warming the planet in a way that's eerily similar to some of the warming events in Earth's past that caused mass extinctions. The difference is that those past warming events were caused by natural processes like volcanic eruptions or slow changes in Earth's orbit. The current warming is being caused by us, which means we potentially have the power to do something about it. The coal forests of 300 million years ago are thus connected to our present in a direct, tangible way. The energy we use to power our civilization comes partly from those ancient forests. The carbon we're releasing into the atmosphere was removed from the atmosphere by those ancient plants. The climate change we're experiencing is partly a consequence of burning what they created. This deep history matters not just as an intellectual curiosity, but as a practical concern. If we want to understand our current situation and predict what might happen in the future, we need to understand the past. The geological and paleontological record gives us a long-term perspective on how Earth's climate system works and how life responds to environmental change. Past climate changes show us that Earth's climate can shift dramatically, sometimes quite rapidly by geological standards. They show us that life is resilient in the long run, with diversity recovering even after massive extinctions. But that recovery takes millions of years. They show us that the specific species and ecosystems we're familiar with are fragile and can be lost. The world of 300 million years ago, with its giant insects, its amphibian giants, its strange forests of lycopods and tree ferns, is utterly alien to us. Yet it's also familiar in fundamental ways. It was a world shaped by the same physical laws, the same biological processes, the same evolutionary forces that shape our world today. Sunlight fell on leaves and powered photosynthesis, converting light energy into chemical energy. Plants grew, died, and in some cases were preserved as fossils. Animals ate plants or ate other animals, moving energy up through trophic levels. Predators and prey engaged in evolutionary arms races. New species evolved, and old species went extinct. Life continued, generation after generation, shaped by selection and chance. If we could somehow visit this ancient world, we'd be struck by how alive it was. Not alive in the sense of alien or exotic, though it would certainly be those things, but alive in the sense of being full of organisms going about the business of living. There'd be drama and beauty, triumph and tragedy, all the things that characterize life in any era. A dragonfly, the size of a hawk, catching prey in midair, would be a spectacular sight. A 2-meter-long amphibian stalking fish in a murky pool would be terrifying. The view from a hilltop, looking out over an endless forest of strange trees, would be breathtaking. The sound of a thunderstorm rolling through the swamps would be both familiar and strange. We can't visit that world, of course. It's separated from us by an unbridgeable gulf of time. The last 300 million years have seen the formation and breakup of a supercontinent, the rise and fall of the dinosaurs, multiple mass extinctions, the evolution of flowering plants, and the emergence of mammals, birds, and eventually humans. The world has been completely transformed, multiple times over, but we can glimpse that ancient world through the window of the fossil record. Every fossil is a message from the past, telling us something about what life was like. Piecing together these messages, combining them with our understanding of geology, atmospheric science, evolutionary biology, and ecology, we can reconstruct those ancient ecosystems in surprising detail. The work of reconstruction is never finished. Every new fossil discovery adds to our knowledge. New analytical techniques allow us to extract more information from existing specimens. Improved understanding of modern organisms and ecosystems helps us interpret the ancient ones more accurately. The picture we have of life 300 million years ago is much clearer now than it was 50 years ago, and it'll be clearer still 50 years from now. This ongoing discovery is one of the exciting things about paleontology. We'll never know everything about the ancient world. There'll always be gaps and uncertainties. But we can keep learning, keep refining our understanding, keep pushing back the boundaries of ignorance. The creatures that lived 300 million years ago are worth knowing about, not just because they're our ancestors, though that's reason enough, but because they're part of the magnificent story of life on Earth. They're chapters in a book that began 3.5 billion years ago, and that's still being written today. Understanding their chapter helps us understand the whole story. That story is one of unimaginable creativity and diversity. Life has produced millions of different solutions to the problem of survival, millions of different ways of making a living, millions of different body plans and strategies and behaviors. The forms that existed 300 million years ago were just a small sample of the total diversity that life has produced. Yet even that small sample included things of stunning beauty and complexity. The intricate structure of a dragonfly wing evolved over millions of years to provide efficient flight. The sophisticated chemical defenses of plants that could synthesize toxic compounds to deter herbivores. The behavioral strategies of predators that could learn from experience and modify their hunting techniques. The symbiotic relationships between different species that benefited both partners. All of this complexity, all of this sophistication, emerged not through conscious design, but through the blind process of evolution, through the cumulative effect of countless small changes over millions of generations. Mutations created variation. Selection favored some variants over others, and time allowed the accumulation of changes that could transform simple organisms into complex ones. The coal forests of 300 million years ago were the product of billions of years of evolution that had come before. The plants that grew in those forests were vastly more complex than the first photosynthetic organisms that emerged over 3 billion years earlier. The animals that lived in and around those forests were vastly more complex than the first multicellular animals that appeared around 600 million years earlier. Yet even these relatively complex organisms were simpler than what would come later. The flowering plants that would revolutionize terrestrial ecosystems hadn't evolved yet. The insects with complete metamorphosis that make up the majority of modern insect species were just starting to diversify. The complex social behaviors seen in ants, bees, and termites hadn't evolved yet. The big brains that would eventually appear in some mammal lineages were still 250 million years in the future. Evolution is an ongoing process, not something that happened in the past and then stopped. The organisms alive today are not the pinnacle or end point of evolution. They're just the current frame in an ongoing movie. In another 300 million years, assuming life on Earth survives that long, the world will be as different from today as today is from the Carboniferous. New forms we can't even imagine will have evolved. Many of today's groups will be gone. The Earth itself will have been transformed by continued plate tectonics, erosion, and climate change. The deep time perspective that geology and paleontology provide is humbling. Humans have been around for such a short time, a few million years at most, and modern human civilization for only about 10,000 years. That's nothing compared to the 3.5 billion year history of life, or the 4.5 billion year history of the Earth. We're newcomers, the latest in a long line of species that have inhabited this planet. Yet in our brief time here, we've had an outsized impact. We're now a geological force, moving more rock and soil than all natural erosion processes combined. We're changing the atmosphere and climate in ways that'll be detectable in the geological record millions of years from now. We're causing an extinction event that future paleontologists, if they exist, will be able to see clearly in the fossil record. This gives us a responsibility. We have the power to shape the future of life on Earth, for better or worse. We can choose to be good ancestors, leaving a world that's still rich and diverse and full of possibility for the species that come after us, human or otherwise. Or we can be a cautionary tale, a species that briefly dominated and then crashed, taking many other species with us. The organisms of 300 million years ago couldn't make such choices. They lived according to their nature, shaped by millions of years of evolution. They couldn't anticipate the consequences of their actions or change their behavior based on abstract reasoning about the future. We can. That's what makes us unique. We have the ability to look back across hundreds of millions of years, to learn from the past, and to use that knowledge to make better decisions about the future. Whether we'll actually do so remains to be seen, but the possibility is there, and that makes this moment in Earth's history potentially pivotal. The coal forests of 300 million years ago are gone, replaced by vastly different ecosystems. The specific organisms that lived then are gone too, though their descendants continue to evolve. But the processes that shaped that world, evolution, ecology, geology, continue to shape our world today. By understanding those ancient processes and their consequences, we better understand our own world and our own place in the grand sweep of Earth's history. That ancient world, so different from ours yet operating according to the same fundamental principles, is a reminder that change is the only constant. Earth has always been a dynamic, changing planet. Life has always been evolving, adapting to new conditions, exploring new possibilities. The world we see today is just a snapshot, a moment frozen in time. Before us lies an unknown future, shaped partly by forces beyond our control and partly by our own choices. Looking back 300 million years gives us perspective. It reminds us that the world we know is temporary, that it too will change and be replaced by something different. But it also reminds us that life is resilient, that it persists and adapts and continues. Whatever challenges we face, whatever changes the future brings, life will go on in some form. The story that began 3.5 billion years ago isn't over yet, and if we're wise and lucky, it'll continue for billions more.